Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, since our previous session yesterday we have been talking a lot about women's studies, why and how women's studies are very important. Today also we are going to touch a very sensitive area. In fact, not sensitive, I would say that in order to know the women's studies, what women's studies is, we need to know this very topic, that is the growth and evolution of women's studies in India, that how and where and when the women's studies grew in India. For this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Sushila Kaushik. She is a retired professor and she was associated with the Department of Political Science, Delhi University. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Sushila Kaushik. Ma'am, welcome to the EDICET lecture. As through you, we learned a lot about the women's studies. We touched a very important area. Today also we are going to know more about how and when the evolution took place. That is, the women's studies came into power, we can say that. So, would you like to continue or touch some areas which we discussed yesterday?
Yesterday. Right, well, hello friends. Yesterday in the course of the lecture, we talked about what is women's studies, the definition of women's studies, how the women's studies as a subject has grown, how over a period of time we have come to recognize women's studies as a separate discipline, though very closely related to all the other disciplines like social sciences or even technical sciences or the sciences as such. And we also found out certain concepts which mainly concern the women's studies and define the women's studies. We were trying to make ourselves understand and think like a women's studies person, develop a certain perspectives with which we peruse, rethink and rewrite our even mainstream disciplines and their theories. With that we sort of came to an end yesterday, and we also talked about the need for a curriculum and how in the college and other institutions we can be teaching women's studies a little different from the way we have been teaching mainstream disciplines, because women's studies essentially is a grassroots subject. It's something which is very closely related to our everyday realities, particularly the reality of women in this country. So with the result, we can do it very well when we all relate closely what's happening with what are the principles and theories of women's studies, because women's studies ultimately are derived from these realities and its theories are based on the everyday experience of women in our country as well as in the rest of the world. Today what we will do, little go further, see how exactly the women's studies grew in this country. Of course, we can talk about the entire world, but to be relevant to our own country, I'll try to talk about how exactly we started with women's studies, how exactly we have grown women's studies, how our policies and policy measures and the acts and the legislation reflect the conditions and status of women. Because women's studies as well as those who are deriving out of women's studies are trying to ultimately enhance the status of women, remove their disabilities, bring about an empowerment, so we occupy an equal citizens of this country without being deprived of our rights and with enough power to exercise our rights and enjoy them for our benefit, more importantly than that, for the benefit of our society and our nation. So the women's studies in turn has to inform our policies, our institutions, their processes, and finally impact on the society, so that we can have ultimately the main objective of women's studies, namely bring about a gender revolution, gender justice in this particular country, in this particular nation. So with that sort of a brief introduction, we will talk about how the women's studies have grown and evolved in this country so far as late as 2014. But even this, though we talk about 2014, we also know that this has a long history in this country. Even during the national movement or even before the national movement, the conditions and the low status of women have been understood, recognized by many of our leaders. We know about it, Raja Rammohn Roy, we talked about the child marriage, we have talked about the abolition of sati. We also, by the early part of this last century, talked about dowry, and many people had talked about the removal of dowry and adopted it in their daily practices. The Indian national movement period particularly witnessed the increase in the educational level of women in this country. We had organizations like All India Women's Conference or National Council for Women with very eminent leaders like Annie Besant, who began talking about the low educational level of women. And a lot of schools were started in this country for girls particularly during the national movement. The educational graph for 1920s and 30s, if you see it, there's a vast jump in the girls' education in this country. We also talked about during that time about planning for women's education in the future. One of the eminent leaders of the Indian national movement, woman leader, Sucheta Kriplani, even made a plan for women's education submitted to the Indian National Congress. But then, because of the exigencies of the Second World War, it somewhat got submerged. Even though the priority of the Indian national movement was on nationalism, national movement, independence in this country, we still had a lot of women leaders with the support of men also began talking about the political freedom of women in this country. So under Sarojini Naidu, a very, very eminent women feminist as well as a women's leader, we began talking about the right to vote for women. We wanted equal franchise along with men. Almost from 1929, when she became the president of the Indian National Congress, she began talking about giving equal rights to vote, suffrage to women as such. So in 1947, when we became independent, there was already a background of a lot of measures for women. So we straight away started with equal citizenship, straight away started about equal voting rights for women in our constitution. And very soon after that, we also talked about the social reforms for this country, for the women of the country. We began looking at the personal laws which were available for the women. So between 1950 and 54, our young leadership at that particular time talked about giving women more legal rights in this country by way of divorce, by way of right to property, by way of marriage, widowhood, and by way of remarriage, etc. But all these concerns and the recognition of these concerns of the women, their low social status, were in the nature of social reforms. They were very closely connected to our nationalist movement. So in the part of nationalism, aim and growth was also women should attain the equal status as such. But still, it was more social reform rather than what we presently call as women's studies in this country. But those of us who began reading these social reforms from the very beginning, then began understanding the nature of Indian women, the status of Indian women, the status of Indian society, and a lot of literature and books came out in this context. One of the very well-known books written by late Professor Neera Desai was on social reforms for women in the Indian national movement, which acted as a very big support to us when we began reading about. So the women's studies really little by little started when we became independent, but it really got a big boost when we began talking about the status of women in 1976. In the first international conference, the conference decade at Mexico in 1975, asked all the states of the world to work out, find out a status of women. But our country did it even little advanced, and by 1976, our first report on the status of women came out. It was titled as Towards Equality. The status of women report really was based on the survey and actual finding of ground reality, because we didn't have much of a literature on women of this nature before that period. It's a first-hand survey which was done, and the status of women's report came out. The status of report in that case started in a way the research in this country on women, and it was followed by a lot of researches which were subsequently followed by our young scholars to find out the low status of women in our country as such. So we have a lot of small researches which emanated after 1976, and we also followed it up by a collection of various studies together and those who are involving themselves in this research. With the result, we have by the end of 1970s a lot of resource centers which began coming out of the women's studies. So you have by the 1970s, late 70s and early 80s, you have very many women's studies resource centers which were started the initiative of some of the very important women's studies scholars who subsequently have become the doyen of women's studies and our mentors in women's studies in the past 2 or 3 decades. The ISST, the Indian Studies Center, Social Studies Center, was started by Professor Devaki Jain, and the Center for Women's Development Studies was initiated by Professor Veena Majumdar, and we have Women's Studies Center as SNDT University started by Professor Neera Desai, and we have a lot of other small organizations, research organizations, which emerged as resource centers for women's studies as such by almost early 1980s. So with the result, we had a lot of data emanating from the ground, because as I said before, we didn't have too much of a literature on women's studies per se before this period. We had a lot of social reform movements, but we did not have the women's studies analyzing them, collecting data and telling us about it. So these centers started that initiation. So soon we began having a lot of researchers and data collection from the fundamentals, from the grassroots in India. All these women and men who began working on women's studies and women's issues then collected themselves together in a conference which was sponsored by the SNDT University and organized by them in 1982 at Bombay, that is now Mumbai, and you had about 500 to 600 people, men and women, who participated in this conference. A lot of discussions took place and quite a few resolutions were brought up in this. One of the important resolutions which came up in this particular conference was to start an Indian Association for Women's Studies. This Indian Association for Women's Studies in turn would be auguring the future growth of Indian studies. And subsequently, it started in 1982. We have this IAWS, as we call it, the Indian Association for Women's Studies, which are going on every once in 2 years, biannual conferences at various universities in India, with IAWS sponsoring these conferences. Lots of young scholars and old scholars come and NGOs and government servants and many others who are interested in women's studies are participating in these conferences, sharing their views and sharing the new researches they are doing and pointing out what future research and the gap they are, which we will have to undertake. This is a very major step in this country for women's studies and keep sort of encouraging the young scholars to pursue it further and move for strengthen themselves in their researches and their methodologies. After the first conference at Mexico, then we had a second international conference at Nairobi in 1985, and that gave a big fill up to women's studies. Once again, we began studying not merely about our own country's women's studies issues, but we also began to know about what's happening elsewhere. Lots of Indian scholars participated in these conferences, which is now held almost once every 10 years in one place or other, and thereby there is an international element in it, an international impact on our women's studies, and more importantly, our women's studies, their conclusions are quite a lot influencing others to recognize that India is one country where women's studies is very strong, where women's studies movement is very widespread. There are a lot of women's studies scholars who with an independent mind are able to work out their own status and find out ways of removing the low status of women. I'll come to that little later when we talk about how we differ and how we influence others. But as soon as these conferences, these reports began coming up, there was a lot of impact which women's studies made on our policies, on our policy measures, on our policy agencies, on our own government as such. With the result, the 1976 equality report had a lot of impact on central government. We had a Minister for Social Welfare, very eminent lady, Dr. Pulrenu Guha, who was the minister at that particular point. She was also the chairman of the Committee on the Status of Women, and that impact was felt on the government. So in 1986, we had a huge conference in Delhi to work out the national education policy. At that particular point, we had in that particular document a very important section. We talked about it even yesterday a little bit. An important section called Towards Women's Equality. This word education for women's equality, which is there as part 4 of the national policy on education, still is the basis for our educational policies in India. We have been recently even quoting it very often, and this particular section is called Education for Women's Equality. It could have been education for women. It could have been education for equality, but it was very specifically put as education for women's equality, which meant it is education for both men and women, both in the university or outside, by teaching or any other means to promote the equality of women in the society. So the goal of education was very clearly spelled out here as women's equality. So all our education should be dealing with, aiming at and achieving the gender equality in this country. This is the implication of calling it as education for equality, women's equality, and not calling it as education for equality of women or education for women or any other word by that time. The education policy went further and expanded it by calling education as an agent of basic change in the status of women. That's why we often call education to be a tool of a social engineering. Education is a tool for bringing about the changes. And here very particularly, it mentioned that education to be an agent of basic change. Basic is very important because it talks about our disabilities, which we talked yesterday about, agent of basic change in the status of women. The education policy went further and ordained that our educational system will play a positive interventionist role in the empowerment of women. Now it used the word educational system, though very precisely it put it as educational system. I'd like to expand this educational system as not merely just the basic education, but education in teaching, through research, through training, through community action, through open university system, through distance education system, or any other aspect of the educational system we may have from time to time, that they all should aim at, focus themselves at playing an interventionist role in the empowerment of women. Again, this word is extremely important. It is just not saying teach women's studies, but uses a very positive qualifying word, interventionist. It's a value loaded word. It means as we go on teaching, as we will go on doing our educational system, or as we go on in the country, things will move on as they are, as they were in the past and into the future, stereotyped way. But what the education policy clearly mentions it, enter into it, change it, bring the changed mindset and play a very active interventionist role for the sake of the empowerment of women. So it is much more than merely a policy, it is almost a policy dictate that education should take this up as a very special focus so that it can direct all its agencies, all its methods to bring about the empowerment of women. It goes further. Women's studies will be promoted as a part of various courses and educational institutions and encouraged to take up active programs of women's development. Once again, this really means in the educational terms that women's studies will be a subject, it will be a discipline in the university setup, that it will be part of the various courses. That means all our curriculum in various subjects should change themselves and see that the women's studies are a part of this changed curriculum. So, curriculum changes in order to incorporate women's studies, and the women's studies perspective is something which the National Policy of Education requires us to do. Secondly, it also talks about active programs of women's development, which means another aspect of our educational system. Our educational system has, besides teaching and research, also training and community action. Here we really are talking in terms of the last two, training and community action. So, we must undertake training and community action, and these training and community action should be again focusing on women's development, and we must have active community action programs as a part of developing women's studies in this country. So, thereby women's studies becomes a holistic discipline. It is not just teaching, it is not some research carried out in some lab, but it is something which really comes to the ground reality and then talks about incorporating the ground reality and developmental program into our syllabus as such. Any education policy, or for that matter any policy in Government of India, is followed by what we call a set of rules and procedures. The National Education Policy was followed by the formulation of what we call the Program of Action, POA as we call it. This program of action tells you the various ways in which the various parts of the policy should be implemented. So, also this policy which is on women's education towards equality also has a lot of space in the program of action. It talks in terms of details of how to bring it about, women's studies in the university system. It mentions the incorporation of all the 4 dimensions I talked about: teaching, research, training and community action. All the 4 dimensions of the university system, women's studies should be part of. Above all, it talks about, very important, suggested the starting of women's studies centers in every educational institution by the year 1995. Which is hardly gives 10 years, not even 10 years, for all the educational institutions in this country to start women's studies centers, which means colleges, university, as well as many research institutions and other teaching institutions, which we have teachers training institutions. Every conceivable educational institution should have a women's studies center by the year 1995. Of course, we are now in the year 2014. But I'll talk about, we have made a lot of enhancement there, but we'll talk about it a little later. So, as a part of this particular, every educational institution should have it. Both the UGC as well as ICSSR and other agencies which come under the Ministry of Education, or what you call HRD, have started a lot of initiatives. Where both the UGC and the ICSSR, which are some important institutions, have started sections on women's studies. They have a standing committee on women's studies, which both these institutions have, which has been charged with the purpose and aim of bringing about and strengthening women's studies in the colleges and the institutions which are under them. As per that, the UGC started a standing committee on women's studies as early as 1983, and it also sponsored workshops along with the Indian Association for Women's Studies to bring about and formulate the content of women's studies centers. And so the UGC adopted a guideline in 1985, and that's called on women's studies, called Women's Studies Perspective on the University System, which in turn became the basis for the UGC starting the women's studies centers all over India. In 1985, the UGC then started women's studies centers on its own initiative in 5 universities. In 1987, they came into operation. Today, it continuously has been expanding. We today have almost 160 centers in the various universities and colleges and autonomous colleges in India. So, up to 11th plan period, the expansion has been quite fast, though we still haven't covered all the educational institutions which the national education policy requires us to have by the year 1995. We at least have made a lot of strides, and almost every state in India as of at present has more than 1 or 2 women's studies centers. Some states have a lot more, and some states may have 1 or 2 depending on the size, and the university's initiative in asking for a center. So today we have more than 160 centers in the whole country as such, and one hopes more such centers will come up in the coming years, so that we will be able to come close to what the national education policy is talking about. The ICSSR also in turn had a standing committee on women's studies, and the ICSSR, which is essentially a research grant institution, has initiated a lot of research fellowships for women's studies and gives grants, projects, and also is supporting the maintenance of various institutions, resource centers, one of which, the CWDS, Center for Women's Development Studies, is being maintained with the support from ICSSR. Other institutions which are also maintained by ICSSR, they all have courses or some sections dealing with women's studies, especially for research and projects purposes. So with the result, we have in the past more than 2 decades, lots of research, lots of data on women coming out of these various institutions. The number of resource centers have increased. There are many resource centers which have been started with the help of UGC and ICSSR, many resource centers which are autonomous research centers. There are research centers within the university as such, even if there is no UGC sponsored women's study centers. The teachers themselves are joining up and are starting their own resource centers. The university is sponsoring a lot of them. With the result, we have sort of a lot of research emanating from it. Our young scholars are taking up this research projects on women for MA, MPhil and PhD dissertation purposes. Seminars and workshops are going on so that they come to know the gaps in the research, so that that acts as a guideline for future researchers too. So women's studies has really taken off in a way in our university system as such. Not merely research as such, but this research in turn is not a meaningless research. It has been able to impact on our policies. It has been able to influence our government as well as other bodies for programs on women. So the women's studies thereby is coming itself close to doing what is expected out of it to do, to create social awareness, change the mindset, bring more research, more data, and influence the government, and thereby bring policies, social legislations for the women of this country. Now, as we proceed on these lines, these are more like the structural, organizational growth and evolution of women's studies in this country. Now, I would also like to sort of focus what have been the main sort of theories or main approach and attitude of women's studies in this particular country. Is there anything which is very specific called women's studies in India, which stands out apart from the international implications of women's studies, international impact of women's studies, and influence on us from abroad? We do have a lot of influence from abroad. In the early days, our research, when it was still a little bit weak, a lot of us were influenced by the writings from the West. The early writings, theoretical writings, essentially fell from the West. But little later, as we moved around the entire world in the form of particularly conferences and workshops, we also came to know about women's studies in other developing and developed countries, on Africa, Southeast Asia, and old South Asia, and now even West Asia. We have a lot of contact and communication with them, so that they also influence us, and in turn we also influence them in a very many ways. A lot of Western scholars have come and stayed in India to study the women's issues in this country, and also have been influenced by us. But what is the difference? What is the difference between us and them? Is there anything which we can call as very specific theories of women's studies in this country? There is a difference between Indian approach to women's studies and the non-Indian or essentially Western approach to women's studies. Actually, women's studies in this country started from social action and social work. It started as part of national movement, which is again a wider political movement. So women's studies thereby in India is being influenced a lot by society and is very much community oriented. The nature of our society, which includes our economy, which includes our polity, which includes our culture, which includes our religion, which above all includes our history. All these have really sort of influenced the nature of women's studies in this particular country. In this country, hence, women's studies is more socially oriented, community oriented, group oriented rather than individual oriented. Our feminism, we do have our feminism, but our feminism is very different from Western feminism, because the Western studies are born in, let me put it very crudely, born in the labs or in the research rooms or in their own personal studies, and whereas our studies have really grown in the wider society. So our Western studies are more individual oriented. They talk from the very beginning about individuals' rights, individuals' status in the society, the exploitation of individual, which is all very good, and I think most of us agree with that. And so the feminism really becomes the feminism of an individual, a woman in the Western society, her place, how she is being deprived or exploited by the society, the nature of the society, or by the mode of production of the society. So you have Western schools called radical feminist school, capitalist feminist school, and socialist feminist school. We in India do not adopt many of these varieties of schools in this country, because our Indian women's studies is very much a community oriented one. So it has to be basically one which is related to our society rather than to an individual, because in India the society quite a lot controls and influences an individual and a family, particularly the woman. So our emphasis over a period of time has been on the social issues, and they get very often linked to or influenced by or relate themselves to what is available in India as a reality, and this reality is definitely class, namely poverty, especially caste, a very great reality, particularly among the caste, not merely the caste hierarchy as such, which is very important, but also the Dalit and the tribals, their position, their status, and religion, again a very strong force in our society. And in religion we make a special mention also of the minorities and include their position. The result is there is a close interface in India between women's studies and these various other social categories. So our women's studies is not a homogeneous women's studies. We do not believe the women is a homogeneous entity in this country. We believe every woman is a part of a religion, part of a caste, part of a class, and she is a woman, though part of a gender. So these four, five factors which is around us definitely influence the status and conditions and the actions of a woman, as well as those who are adopting the patriarchal views about women. That's precisely the reason why sometimes one author or some of our authors talk about patriarchies in this country. They just don't talk about one patriarchy, the male patriarchy as such, but they also talk about patriarchies because caste, class, gender, as well as religion and ethnicity, all of them in their own way control women in this country. So you have a multiple type of patriarchies which exist in our country as such. And over and above that, of course, customs and traditions which are part of either our caste or our religion or our region, whatever it could be, they also have an extremely important role for us. Above all, we have a long history, centuries of history, and at least part centuries of recent history. We have had a colonial history, and with the result, this history also has been making a difference to status and ways of living of women. We do have a regional differences in this country, north and south, northeast and the mainland in India, mainly because of this historical reality. Different types of invasions have taken place in the north. The south has remained a little more isolated from them. The west has its own historical influences. The result is we consider these, when we do the Indian history, when we do the women's movement in India, we relate this history and women's movement together, and we believe the women's studies have a myriad forms, not one conclusion, but a lot of complicated conclusions in this country. There's a diversity with that. That's why we say the Indian women are not homogeneous, and so one strong conclusion may not fit all in this particular country. We also have a legal basis for our women's studies and women's movement, mainly because of our history, namely the Indian national movement, and how when the Indian national movement finally succeeded and we became independent, we adopted a constitution. Subsequently, we adopted a lot of legal rights for women derived out of the basic constitutional positions, both on fundamental rights as well as on directive principles of state policy. Basing on that, over a period of time, we have made a lot of legislation for women in this country, and sometimes are even able to modify some of the personal laws of women in this country. There is also a very big, the reason why we have a lot of legal rights is one, of course, is because of our directive principles of state policy, but also because from the very beginning, our basic philosophy, even in our polity, the basic approach of even our Indian polity has been one of a welfare state approach. We didn't adopt one of the existing ideological sort of policies which other countries had when we became independent, but we adopted, of course, state-headed and state-led, but a welfare state approach, because that is the way our society has been constituted, with a tremendous section of our population still being poor, deprived, rural, and not exposed to modernization, not exposed to modern benefits and facilities. So with the result, the welfare state approach of our polity influenced the approach of our women's studies too. So the women's studies as well as the state in India believed in formulating a lot of social legislations in this country. In fact, I have read somewhere in the entire world, perhaps India has the maximum number of social legislations for as such, and a lot of social legislation for women in this country. There have been very many legal and judicial protection which the Indian women have had, which the Western women have not had at all. The maternity provision has not been there, is still not there in some of the best capitalist countries in the world. We do not have, they did not have the right to vote much for later they acquired it than India ever did. India became independent, straight away gave the right to vote on an equal footing to the women of this country, irrespective of what her qualifications may be. And that is where this approach of social welfare has helped a lot in bringing a lot of social legislations, protective legislations, and today judiciary becomes one of our important protector and supporter in coming out with judgments even where the constitution may be silent or there may be gaps in our directive principles of state policy. So they have been able to bring about change in the society, rights for the women, and intervene where they have to bring in, mainly because of this welfare approach and these two provisions of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. Moving to another area, namely how the women's studies has helped us. We have had a lot of research and teaching in this country, and most of the research and teaching in this country have been on the field of legal and constitutional provisions, legal and constitutional protection, the role of judiciary for women, for the empowerment of women in this country. So that's where we are also very much the research and teaching and theories which we formulate are in a way influenced by this social welfare approach, the community oriented approach. And so I believe that we are different from the feminist approach of the West. We are still feminists. We still would like to have the gender equality, gender justice, and many other things. But our theories, our studies, and our approach are influenced essentially by the diverse reality of India, the pluralistic history, pluralistic composition of India, and the various religions, castes, and class levels we have in this country. This essentially comes out mainly because our research and is based on methods which are not merely theoretical, but methods which derive theories from our field surveys. In fact, because there was a lack of information before, a lot of surveys have to be done in order to get the reality grassroots phenomenon into our research. So much emphasis has been placed in this country from the very beginning and even now on field surveys, data collection from ground reality, research and action. You do research and see the impact on the people, on action, and then do the research again to see what impact the action has had on them, what type of feedback we can get, what type of awareness we can bring, and what is exactly their aspirations, and monitoring is on the basis of our own research. We have a lot of social interactions. The interviewing method of India itself is very different from what mainstreams would do. We have observation method, we have living in method, we go and live with the families and so see everything in reality rather than just interviewing one fine morning and come away. We do action in the society by staying there in the villages. I myself have many fortunate opportunities when I could stay there for a month or 15 days and keep watching them, keep observing them, and at the same time also do research with a community action. The reason is not merely we benefit from their answers to our research, but they benefit from our presence in their area. So many of these women have begun asking, you have come and gone, but what have we got out of it? So with the result, a lot of research in this country combines community action with research, which helps both ways. It helps the researchers, but it also helps the community. And a lot of women studies today are doing awareness raising. Not merely the NGOs, but the women study centers are also doing awareness raising because they could do and answer a lot of queries from the community women on very many issues. So awareness raising is a very important area which we have taken in the course of either research or in the course of celebrating important events or going and doing a camp in the villages or either on health or female infanticide, feticide, or many other social issues where you have to directly talk to the women, which maybe our male volunteers will find it a little difficult, but the women are able to talk on that. So the women study centers are able to reach the women directly, socially, and in an intimate way, and can explain to them the evils of some of these practices which many women have been following without even questioning or have been forced to follow because of our patriarchal forces, patriarchal ways of thinking. That's where I believe in general that our feminist theories are there, but they are different. They are derived because of because of our field action, may be because of our close touch with the women in the community, particularly rural and hinterland, or even in the urban slums, with the women in the various classes, particularly the lower classes, with the women from the Dalit and the other lower groups in the society, and a lot of research has been carried on into the tribal areas in this country, so the tribal customs are understood and preserved and their ethnicity is valued rather than just push them under one uniform bulldozer type of a role of women's studies. So the women's studies is growing, and it will grow as it is more and more in touch with the reality. In conclusion, I can just mention that the women's studies have grown a lot. Where we started, say, in 1975 in a scientific, organized women's studies fashion, and where we are by 1915 and 2015, and we move further. The women's studies have become very innovative, very creative, mainly because of this particular touch with reality, touch with the people, touch with the women in this country. And so we find very often any policy and every policy which is being made in this country, or any action which is being undertaken in this country, either by the government or by non-governmental sources or by community sources, civil society sources, are being constantly subjected to a certain type of evaluation and pointed out, mainly because we know the reality and we see whether this reality in any way is being thwarted or completely overthrown, and what are the social evils which are coming out of it. The contradictions on the scene, on the ground of a policy is being really clearly reflected, mainly because now it is understood and recognized that women constitute half of this country, and that women are the lowest of the low in this country, whether you do it caste wise or class wise, poverty wise, living conditions wise or rights wise, whatever way you think in terms of, women constitute the lowest level of in this country. So with the result, unless we are able to bring succor to them, we would have never thought our country has become developed. So that's the biggest contribution which women's studies has done to this country, both by way of knowledge output in the form of research, or awareness output in the form of teaching and community action, or training the future administrators or present administrators in the form of various types of training programs which women's studies undertake for officials, or training the future leaders, where the women's studies now undertakes a lot of training of women leaders, particularly at the local grassroots level, at the panchayat level. The amount of training the women have been undertaking, women study centers and the NGOs have been undertaking for the elected and aspirant members of the Panchayati Raj is something which has been going on almost like a revolution at the ground level, a silent revolution over a period of time. Our Panchayats is the biggest tribute, with women being the chairpersons of Panchayats and members of Panchayats, has been the biggest achievement of women's studies and women's movement in this country. That's the most visible one. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving such a productive session. I have few questions which I feel that it could be fulfilled only by you. Ma'am, do you feel so? The need for upliftment of women paved the way for the women's studies, because if we go back to the history, right from Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who take effort to abolish sati, as well as Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, with whose effort this Widow Remarriages Act came into being. So do you feel so that this need for upliftment caused the way for the women's studies in India?
Well, theoretically one can say that the lower you go, there's no other, you will come out. But that's not merely the need for that, but there's also a consciousness about it. The other important thing about India is we didn't expect only women to work for women. In our country, there's the biggest difference is the men have worked for women too. And so men and women have joined up together. Some of our earliest social reformers, as you mentioned right now, have been men. So it's a joint effort. Well, yes, there is a need and you recognize the need. See, for centuries there have been a need, but we didn't become cognizant of this need or cognizant of this status of women. We did not evoke any concern, and so we did not have any recognition of it. The fact that we have been able to recognize this and express a concern for it, then work towards it. This is definitely true. That's why our women's studies is solidly based. It's based on foundations of this concern and recognition, and not really something which was just derived as a, well, I'm not going to be very strict about it, but not as only as a theoretical imagination or creativity, or only looking at others, but on the basis of our own past traditions, history, actions which have been taken by earlier people, and their concern and recognition. We have improved upon it and gone into the depth of it. Okay, the early social reformers did think about these various reforms. They brought even legislations, they even influenced the British regime to bring about some legislations, but then they didn't go into why it's happening. They didn't get into the patriarchal roots of this. They didn't get into the dimensions of these patriarchal roots. They didn't get into the consequences of if you throw out what will happen. Nothing, those sort of dimensions were not talked about. It is only when the women's studies came up, they could go into the roots of the various things. At which point of history did we have these sort of institutions emerging, when and how the status of women came down, and why, and so that you can then go into the roots of the issue and try to solve them. And women's studies is one which wants to go into the depth of an issue, see the roots of the problem, and then see how exactly we can bring about change. Otherwise, it will remain very superficial change, which will not change the society, but it may change some institution. That's all. That's perhaps one of the reasons why still we are not able to abolish dowry, in spite of the fact dowry legislation has happened, even though widow remarriage is allowed, and a lot of widow remarriage does take place according to, as per that legislation, but our society still has not moved on it very much forward, that it has become a very important social process or institution. So that means that there is something more than a legislation. Merely expressing a concern, merely changing an institution, or merely bringing about social legislation are important, but they have a limitation. The limitation comes only when you bring about change at the undercurrents of the society. And so women's studies understands that. So women's studies takes their action, pays whatever respect has to be paid for the earlier reformers' initiative and their success, but then goes beyond that to see why it happened, why still you have not been able to achieve the 100% result.
So can we say that women's studies is a combo of researches, policies, awareness? Can we say that?
In this context, it's definitely a combo of research and teaching, training and action undertaken by the university community, university persons themselves. Of course, a lot of work has been going on by outside agencies, what you call non-governmental agencies, social action agencies, voluntary agencies. But sad to say, the women's studies, the educational system in this country was the last to come up. Even though these movements have been going on even during the nationalist movement period, they have been going on in 50s and 60s. But we came into the picture as a university educational system only after 1980s. So we were late, but we are trying to make up. And because this is a very important field, and we do believe education is a leading instrument for bringing about a social change. Not only it educates, but it also goes beyond education to bring about the changes, changing the mindset. So we were a little late, but we do hope with all these various efforts, women's studies may make the social reformers right and successful by questioning them, but also pointing out to them the limitations of their approach, and also trying to be with them to bring about the changes in the society.
Ma'am, it is easy to talk about women's studies. Apart from studying women's studies, we basically talk about the outcomes through which we think of a development. But if we go towards the rural areas where the condition of the women is still not very good, do you feel so Anganwadi has played a crucial role in uplifting their current status or present status?
Well, Anganwadi is one institution which has been brought about for the sake of a certain limited aim. It's able to bring about something, but the Panchayati Raj have been able to bring about a lot more. You see, political power is very important. Political empowerment is extremely important. That's why we keep asking for even the reservation for women in the assemblies and the parliament and every other organization and every other committee. We want it because the political empowerment gives a certain power to the women. This power is required. You see, one of the important disability women had in India was the powerlessness within the family, powerlessness within the society, powerlessness within the office, even if you work. So, the women began thinking over a period of time, power is a bad institution, one should not aim at power, only men can have power, women should not claim even power, which is wrong. I think without the power you don't have the capacity. Without the capacity you cannot achieve what you want to achieve, whether it's political, social or even in your immediate life. So this political empowerment and the introduction of Panchayati Raj in the rural side of India particularly has been a tremendous, I won't call it creative, but tremendous tool for bringing about a consciousness in the village. I don't agree that they don't know still what's happening around. Education, literary education cannot be equated with the education which is political education or social education. Well, yes, many of the older generations among the women in our rural side of India have missed out on education. Maybe the younger ones are all getting themselves enrolled, but the older ones, many of them have been totally illiterate. But that doesn't mean that they do not understand or they are not conscious. The most important one is even when they are conscious, they have no access to it. They are not able to reach to it, what they want to. So there is a gap between our policies and their policies reaching the women, particularly of the rural side of India. So that's why I said the lowliest of the low is women. The lowliest of the low will be village women. So if you go on seeing like that, then we feel how much we have developed over a period of time. All the development which has taken place in this country are still to reach every woman in the rural or even urban slums are not better off. The health, for instance, is the most important access which development which they have no access to at all, the rural side of India. We all know it, we understand it, a lot of education surveys have been done on it. So instead of saying that devils have not gone up, whether one Anganwadi institution can bring about the social revolution in the villages, we must see how the various developmental indicators which we have, whether they have reached the women in this country in the rural side or urban side for that matter.
With this note, I would like to thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much. And I would say students who might be watching us that they should opt women's studies as their careers so that they can make their sincere effort in the development of women in our country. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I must say, finish one sentence there which made me very happy about. I hear the 10+2 or the +2 stage, now they have introduced gender studies and women's studies as one of the options. I think it's a very timely measure. It is at that level we really require women's studies, and that will make those who opt for it, or even if they don't opt for it, it will bring about a little different type of an atmosphere in the schools, and they will be able to pursue women's studies when they come into colleges.
Definitely, it will generate a consciousness and awareness among the students, whether male or female. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.